Hello and welcome to Sprint Security LDAP integration and SAML extension. This is bonus section and talk about the Sprint Security testing framework. So in this section, we will learn how can we test method security, how can we set up mock MVCs with the Sprint Security, then how can we use request post processor to perform request, how can we use request builders to do the form logins. This will be all JUnit test cases. And how can we use result matches to validate the result. Now in the first video, we will talk about how can we test the method security. So we will revisit the Sprint Security configuration and then we will see how did we secure method in a Sprint Security and then we will test it. So if you are new to Sprint Security, it is recommended to go and sign up for Secure Your Spring based application tutorial by Pact. Now let's go to Eclipse, Spring Security, Method Security Test. This is a Maven project. In the Java resources, we have config, transfer object and controllers. In the config, we have web application initializer. Now let's see everything one by one. This is where everything drives. So this is the starting point which actually initializes and configure your dispatcher servlet. Class web app initializer extend abstract annotation config dispatcher servlet initializer and has the servlet mapping. So your dispatcher servlet should be mapped to / that's what you are doing, and then you are giving the configuration to webconfig.class. Servlet config class is webconfig. If you do have any database or something that you want to initialize, you can set up in root config classes. Now let's see web config. In the web config, we deal with the view resolvers, request context listener, or everything that you want to deal with comes in the web config. Now if you want to use Spring Security, default login page as a form login, that is /login, the URL would be, then you would have to add this controller to view controller registry at the highest precedence using this method. Now apart from web config, you will see security web application initializer. This initializes the security config, the security configuration for your application. This extend abstract security web application initializer. So in web app initializer, you had dispatcher servlet initializer. In the web config, you had web MVC configurer adapter, and this is where you are enabling the web MVC. This is a configuration and you are doing the component scan of all the packages. The base package is comdemo, and then you have other packages like comdemo.to, comdemo.web, those kind of. In security web application initializer, you are in the constructor, you are passing security config.class. Now let's see. Everything related to security configuration of a Spring resides in security config.java. This is also a configuration, and that's where it is enabling the web security must. And then we will see the method security. Here we are doing the component scan, comdemo config, if you do want to auto-wire anything. Now, the authentication starts with the configurer global, where you had authentication manager builder, and this authentication manager builder requires the authentication provider. Now there are a lot of kind of authentication provider in Spring Security, like that we saw LDAP authentication provider, and we have JDBC authentication provider. So we have DAO authentication provider, the default one, SAML authentication provider, we also saw that. Now the authentication provider that we are using is DAO authentication provider, and we are setting the user detail service. The user detail service that we are creating is as a bean, and we are creating a in-memory user detail service, passing two users. The one user is chief with the password, and the role of this user is chief. Second user is agent, and the password is user password, and the role of this user is agent. So just imagine this application as a FBI or high security company application, wherein you have chief and then you have agents to work on particular cases. In the configure method, you have regex measure, and then you are checking all the requests that is coming to /chief, and then everything should have a role chief, and any user who's accessing /agent and any request should has the access and the has role agent, and the rest of the request will be everything not rest of the request. All requests will be authenticated because we haven't given explicitly to permit all till now. The HTTP basic, the kind of authentication that we are using. Do we need a SSL channel? Request insecure. That means we are not using any SSL channel as of now. That means HTTPS we are not using. Form login is the login page and it should be redirected to the login. That is a default Spring Security login URL which we added in the view controller registry. This needs to have all users access, anonymous access. That's why permit all. If the access denied exception occur, then HTTP exception handling, and this should be redirected to access denied method. If you are doing the logout custom URL is custom logout. Otherwise, the default logout for Spring Security is /logout. The logout success URL where it should redirect the user after the successful logout should be the / logout success handler that we are using is custom logout success handler. Invalidate HTTP session is always true. Logout handler that we are using is security context logout handler. This is by default the logout handler of Spring Security. And then we want to delete the cookie with the name of JSessionID. We talked about Spring Security configuration. And then in the controller, we have home controller. If anybody is accessing the URL /, he would be redirected to home page. If anybody who is accessing the URL custom logout, then it would be taken by logout filter and everything will be processed like that way. It's just that we had created a custom logout. That's why we would have to provide a method with the same request method variable like post or get. Now the handler will do all the job. This is just to provide the method without the body. Now if you are using chief update profile, this is a get method. We have agent update profile to update profile by agent. That is also a get method. Now if this method is got accessed by other than chief user, this should not happen because we already configured in security config.java that all requests that is coming to chief should have a role chief and all requests that is coming to agent should have a role agent. Now there is another method with user name test. This requires the user that is accessing this method should have a name of agent. This is the access denied method which is actually redirecting you to access denied. Now this access denied will be taken by view resolver and do the suffix of .gsp, do the prefix of webinf. So this access denied.gsp page will be stored in webinf. We have another method. Let's talk about when we do the method security now. Now apart from doing the security configuration by doing the regex measure, we can set the method security using the annotations. So now let's go to presentation. So what do we need? First of all, the dependency that you need for a Spring Security test framework. So let's see the POM file. The JUnit that we are using is 4.12. The Spring framework that we are using is 4.3.5. The Spring Security framework that we are using is 4.2.1. And the Spring Security test that you'll be needing for test framework is Spring Security test with the release 4.2.3. That's it, as in for the dependency. That's all you need for Spring Security test framework. Now, if you want to enable the method security, you can enable using this annotation @enable global method security with secured enabled equals to true. Else, you can also use enable global method security pre-post enabled equal to true. And there is one more to have a support of JSR 250 annotations. So Spring Security also supports JSR 250 and according the method security annotations. Now let's go. Alright, in our Spring Security, we have commented regex patcher of chief and agent, and then we are using the first enable global method security and secured enable equals to true. So if we use enable global method security with secure enabled, in that case we have an annotation called @secured. So this annotation will work if I set is authenticated anonymously, that this / method, then the request that is coming up is anonymous user or not. So that's being checked by @secured is anonymous, is authenticated anonymously. Now if you want a user to be authenticated to access something, let's say the custom logout, the user should have a valid authentication object with it. then it should be @secured and the user should be authenticated. Now if you want to have this method chief update profile to be accessed by only chief user or the user who has the role of chief, then you can set @secured role chief. Similarly, role agent, and then that's it. If you want to configure with pre-post enabled, then you would have to enable this and comment this. So you can use only one at a time. So if you are using enable global method security with pre-post enabled, in that case you have pre-authorize, the access is anonymous, pre-authorize, the role is agent, so this is a chief, so this should be chief access. And then if you want to access a method, then pre-authorize, the username of the authentication object or the principal that is trying to access this method should be agent. So that's how you can use the method security. Now let's do the testing of the method security that we just did. So if you go to source, test and Java, you have a package com-demo test, and in that you have method security test.java. Now let's go. Now how can you test the method security? You can test with the mock user, create a user and start testing it, the methods. So do the post or get request to the method and see and validate the result. You can also check with the user detail. So if you have created a user detail bean in your application, then you can leverage that bean to have the testing with the user detail. Now this is the JUnit configuration. Let's start with the import part. So for the test framework, what we are using is, if you want to do the testing with mock user, then you would need security text context support mock user. If you want to do with the mock with user detail, then you would need this import. This is must that use Spring J Unit 4 class runner. That's what your JUnit will start with. Now with the @run with, you would use Spring J Unit 4 class runner class. In the context configuration, the class that is holding the context configuration in your application, that you should give over here. So the classes that is holding the configuration is webconfig.class, which creates the context for our application. You can provide multiple classes here in a way like this. So if you want to have security config as well, and then import this class. So you can have multiple context configuration classes as well if you have in your application. Now this is a web app configuration, and in this a class we have auto-wired a home controller, and with this home controller object we would be calling the home controller or the controller methods. Now the first one is, if you want to use update chief profile, so let's see what this method does. So update chief profile is a method that requires a chief object to update the user profile. Now, so before doing the testing, let's see the demo of this application, the working of this application. Now this is a /login, the default Spring Security login page. Now let's try to log in with the chief user. The password is password. This is the welcome chief page. Now if you want to update, I'm a chief user, and if I try to access the agent update profile, I should not have the access. Let's try logging in. Now you are not authorized to view this page. Let's go home. Let's try with the chief user. Let's try to update chief profile only. Let's try accessing this page, and then we are drop down to chief profile update page. Now we can log out, and let's try logging in with the agent user. Agent password of agent user is user password. Let's try logging in. If I want to have the access of chief update profile and with the agent user, I should not have the access. You are not authorized. See, this is actually getting in from the access denied page, and with the agent update profile, of course I would have the access because I am an agent. Now that's it. Now let's start the testing of methods. First of all, we have global method security with secured enabled equals to true. So in this case, we have the @secured annotation in force. Now @secured with authenticated on the custom logout, @secured chief update profile, role chief, @secured on agent update profile, and that's it. And in that method security test page and method security test class, let's have the first method which actually expect test, and the @test expects that this method will throw an exception, authentication credentials not found, because when you are accessing update chief page, it should have a role of chief with the @secured annotation that we have used, right? So in this case, an authentication credential should be passed to have it checked that the user that is trying to access it does have an authority of chief or not, the role of chief or not. Now the second method is actually using creating a mock user. So if you define @ with mock user, and the mock user role should be chief, right? And you are trying to access the update chief page, this should success because the user that you are trying to access this page with has the role chief. Now another method does have with mock user, and it is actually passing the username as well. Over here it was only passing the role. Now if you pass the username and the authorities, and let's say you are trying to access a method with username test. So this method do is it actually doing the pre-authorize, but pre-authorize is not in enforce for now because we have commented it. So let's not talk about this method for now. Once we do enable the pre-authorized, we will see about that. Now with the user detail service, you can use the user detail service as well. So in your security config, you have created a bean of user detail service which has two users, chief and agent, along with it. Now in method security test, if you want to use with the user detail service and the value is XYZ that you are using for the user. So remember, there is no XYZ user detail service bean, right? So in that case, because you have also defined the bean name is user detail service. So if you have multiple, then you can define the bean name as well. So here there is no user of XYZ with your bean user detail service. So this test should fail. Now let's try running this test. The unit test. That's done. Let's see what failed and what didn't. So the first one is expected test. This was expected that it would throw the authentication exception. Once it was expected that it will throw it, so the test cases was passed. Now the second method, let's drag it to right. Okay, with user details test. So this was supposed to fail because there was no XYZ user with your user detail service bean. Now see the error that we have got is unable to create security context using the user detail service that you had used, and the value is XYZ that you are using, right? Now with mock MVC, user test and then user only role test. So we had provided chief here and then we had used the agent with the mock user test. Now let's do some changes in the test, and instead of XYZ, let's try using the chief user here, and then in the security config, let's enable the pre-post enabled equals to true. So in that case, one method that came in force is pre-authorize with the username should be agent while you are accessing with username test method. So let's go to a method which is actually calling with username test method, and over this method we have with mock user, the username is agent and the authority is agent, and the method that we have is it actually checks the user should be agent. So this test should also pass. Now remember that authorities that we are using instead of the roles. So if you want to use roles, you should be providing role along with the agent. So it's one on the same thing, unless if you are using authorities, you don't have to provide role. If you are using roles, you would have to provide role agent. Now let's execute this test. So this test should pass, along with this test should also pass. Now all the tests passed. Now let's see. The expected was expected user detail service. Now we had used chief user because that chief user is already present with user detail service that we had. Then with that being, this test was passed. Now if you are using mock user test, this is also passed because this was actually seeking the agent user name.